A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood starring Tom Hanks has Mr. Rogers and his simple and effective teachings back in the spotlight. But Junlei Li, a senior lecturer and early childhood educator at Harvard Graduate School of Education, has long held Rogers in high regard. Li's work is significantly influenced and inspired by that of Rogers, who created the PBS show of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Li recently joined me in the studio after a speaking engagement in our region.
When people think about Fred's work, because his work is early childhood, and we think of it as kind of, oh, we watched this program when we were children, right? So there's a lot of nostalgia. But I think the reason that so many people today feel so connected to his work, it's not just looking back, but that somehow we're trying to draw something from our memories of his work, from our memories of the way we feel when we were watching the television, and we're trying to apply it to today, right? How we live our own lives today. And I think that's the idea of kind of Fred forward, or what would Fred do, right? Or more importantly, kind of what can we do with the lessons we think we have learned from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Who do you think will benefit from asking themselves that question, what would Fred do?
Anyone who is ever a neighbor to somebody else. And I guess that just means pretty much everyone.
So not just parents or caregivers of little ones.
Anyone, yeah, anyone who in their professional work, in their community work, in their everyday life are involved and invested in supporting other people, whether these other people are very young children, or whether the other people are elderly, or their peers, or just anybody in the community.
I read that you grew up in China, and so you did not grow up with Fred Rogers, like so many of us did as kids, right? And I also read that you first saw him in an Eddie Murphy impression on Saturday Night Live. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
So when you went, something there obviously piqued your interest, because I also read that you went and watched video of actual Fred Rogers being Mr. Rogers. Were you looking for an early childhood model, or looking for something that you might be able to teach, or were you just purely checking things out?
I went to graduate school in Pittsburgh, where Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was filmed and produced. And so some mornings, if I'm not first thing off to class, I would turn on my public television station, and there would be reruns of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I initially approached it as someone who was studying child development. But I think there's something very powerful about his program, that it wasn't just about child development. It was about who we are as human beings. And I think the sense that someone like me, who grew up in almost literally on the other side of the world, who never grew up with the program, but nevertheless found a deep connection to what he has to say, not just as a child development professional, but as a human being. I think that itself seems to me an illustration of the kind of universal deep ideas that Fred was talking about through Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah, one of those ideas that I've heard you talk about is the idea that anything is worth doing, anything that's worth doing takes effort. Why is that something that you focus on and talk about?
I think we think of the world sometimes as kind of almost a black and white world, right? So you're either a good parent or you're a bad parent, you're a good teacher or a bad teacher, and so on. And I think of most of our work is in a constant state of striving. Parents are striving to grow as parents, even as children grow. Teachers are striving to grow as teachers. Even those of us who are in the professional world, or who are producing television, for example, we're always growing, right? And so when I think of what Fred talked about, kind of you've got to do it, you've got to try, I think it's this idea that we actually learn and grow through striving, as opposed to think of ourselves as ready-made, and you either have something or you don't.
And so that idea of the striving, just the trying in and of itself is good. I remember him talking also about just trying it, even if you fail. Trying again is very important. But I think about parenting and parents and kids today. Do you think it's kids who are afraid to fail, or parents who are afraid to see their kids fail?
I think for families and for teachers in schools, I think sometimes as a culture we are so narrowly focused on a very small set of metrics or outcomes. And when you narrow the field like that, then people naturally are afraid to fail, right? And I think in Mr. Rogers' way of thinking about a person who's growing, he would always say, any one of us is more than just one thing, right? So a young high school student is more than just the college they're admitted in, and a 5-year-old is more than whether he or she can sit down and be quiet. There are just so much aspect of our learning and growing, and I think the more we think of ourselves and think of children as whole human beings that grows and learns in all these different ways, the less I think we would be so anxious about failing at one particular thing. And it's not the failing that I think is the challenge, it's this pressure that we feel if we fail, that must mean we're not good at it, and therefore it's not even worth striving. I think that's the challenge, right? That if we believe that, oh, we failed, that just means we try harder.
Or try something different, make an adjustment.
That's right, try a different approach. And I think believing that our development as children as well as adults consists of striving rather than measured accomplishment, for example.
I was looking on your website, the simple interactions approach that you talked about, and there's a graphic that really stood out to me, and one part of it says child development, and it says active ingredient, human interactions. Right. And that just really touched me when I read that. Do you think that we overcomplicate things today and sort of underestimate the value of that simplicity?
I think we live in a world that is complicated, and the world conveys to parents, to families, a lot of noisy information. But something that I've often learned from Fred's work and the standard by which he held himself up to, he would say something to the effect that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. So I think each of us, no matter what we do personally and professionally, we can kind of look across our own lives, look across our calendars and go, we have a lot of complexity here. But I think the question we can ask ourselves is, what is deep and simple about what we do as a professional, as a parent, as a member of the community? And then that question inevitably will turn to, what is deep and simple about you, the person?
Yeah.
And what about that part of you that you bring to what you do? And I think the closer we stay connected to that, the more we're able to navigate through the shallow and complex world and have the confidence to keep striving regardless of whether we're succeeding or not.